We enjoy talking USC football with Chris Swanson. You can join him on Trojansports.com. It's part of the Rivals platform. Chris, how you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing great.
Good.
Doing great. So the last time we talked was sometime late in the season. Of course,
Yeah.
USC was able to march on to the Pac-12 championship with a second win over Stanford. And then in what was billed as the best non-playoff matchup, kind of a dud of a game against Ohio State. Not that either team was really that dynamic on offense. So the Buckeyes grabbed a lead. They sat on it and took advantage of turnovers. Just your assessment of USC's season and the culmination of a season that I'm guessing, and I'm also gathering from feedback from other USC people that even though there's a Pac-12 championship to be hoisted and placed in the trophy case for the first time in 9 years, not a lot of people still satisfied.
No, I think that they're not satisfied because of the preseason expectations. USC was expected by many people to compete for the playoffs and for a national championship. And I think after the Cotton Bowl, it was clear that USC was very far away from being a championship team. I think that if USC had competed with Ohio State, I think that, if they had really made it a close game or won, then you could have argued that maybe they were at that level or close to that level. But I thought it was clear that USC wasn't anywhere near that. And so I think even the people that had expectations short of that thought they could lose a couple of games and that they weren't a perfect team, it was kind of a surprise how uncompetitive they were against Ohio State and then also against Notre Dame this year. The schedule, even though USC won a Pac-12 championship, turned out to be pretty easy. USC only beat teams that had 5 or more losses at the end of the day. They lost to every team that had 4 losses or better, and against teams that looked like they were, serious top 15, top 10 teams. USC wasn't very competitive. So I think it's fair to be disappointed with this season, even with the record in the championship in the conference, because USC also had Sam Darnold and Ronald Jones. That's a combination of a quarterback and a running back that almost never comes around. I think it's their best combination that they've had since Matt Leinart in that backfield behind him. So who knows what they're going to do with those guys leaving. The defense seemed pretty good. And I think that was a bright spot, but USC's offensive line was an absolute mess. It seemed like when they played Ohio State that there was just a difference in the development of the roster or the talent of the roster or something, because USC lost by 17 points. It wasn't close. Notre Dame threw them aside like they were nothing as well. So I think the season, it's fair to call it disappointing. USC lost 3 games. That's not acceptable at a program like USC at the end of the day.
So it's an interesting assessment because people do look at the quarterback first and foremost, and then they look at the guys handling the ball. Even if that's not the most important element of the team, we know that the game's won with the quarterback and then at the line of scrimmage. And Ronald Jones, for as impressive as he is, and Deontay Burnett and some guys on defense that are extremely capable, do you think that that's the culprit of the offensive line, the first and foremost culprit of USC not being quite as good as maybe we thought?
I think it's probably the most obvious one because when USC played teams that, had good defensive lines, were good in the trenches, they didn't protect Sam Darnold. They didn't move the ball with the running game. It really felt like through Ronald Jones's career, he gained all these numbers and, he moved up, this list at USC of all-time rushing yards. But it felt like every big game, he was kind of a non-factor. He couldn't run the ball, and that's USC's offensive line. It felt like Sam Darnold, even in some great performances, was running for his life all day. I think if you look at the offensive line, they had, young guys that had to step in. They had guys playing the wrong position. So that's the spot that I would look at first. After that, I think that it's fair to question the coaches just because of the resumes that they have. And you wonder, were some of these games that were so bad because they were out schemed, or some of these games that they played that maybe they won, but were maybe a little bit too close and closer than they should have been. Was that because the other team with less talent had a coaching staff that was out scheming them? That's fair to question. I don't know for sure, but those are really the first 2 things that pop into my mind when I think of, why did USC seem to fall so short of, not just a national championship, but being in the conversation. They were kind of in the playoff conversation at the end, But when it came down to it and they played other teams that seemed like they were in the conversation for the playoffs at the time, USC wasn't in the game and they didn't belong. So those are the two things that I look at. The offensive line seemed like they were overmatched in those games, and I'm not sure about the coaches, and I think that's fair to question at this point.
Chris Swanson joining us from Trojan Sports on the Rivals platform for USC athletics, USC football in particular. And I think you make two really valid points. So the one would be the score comparison. So I don't think any one or two games, a lot of people like to string out the transitive property of who beat who, and they A plus B equals C and scores and so forth. But if you take a bulk of scores, then maybe you can start to build a narrative. And USC, yeah, beat the marginal teams and lost to the good teams. And to a certain extent, based on what we saw out of Washington State late in the season, getting crushed by Washington, getting blasted by Michigan State, albeit without Luke Falk. But I don't know that Washington State was a really, really good team. So even that close loss on the road, and then the two teams, Ohio State and Notre Dame, that proved to be near the elite or among the elite, yeah, those were not close football games. And then to your point, in regards to, yeah, that's an interesting point. And Chris, I'll have to stop right there because I had something else to follow that up with that you said that I thought was pretty good. But okay, I'll get there. Anyway, I'll edit that. So as we look at USC heading into 2018, obviously this early signing period, Chris, was a different dynamic for everyone across the board, preparing for a bowl game with USC, one of the few teams in college football that had to prepare for a championship game. And then that sizing down the window of time to close on some of these deals with these early signees. But despite the numbers not being there in quantity, it's an extremely impressive class.
Yeah, it is. This USC signed 10 players in the early signing period, and I think that was something that they need to do. They kind of filled up the class a little bit, and they don't have a big class this year overall. So they're right at the edge right now with scholarship numbers, and I think that they looked at this early signing period and said we need to address certain needs and bring these guys in and make sure that they're in, and they did that. They addressed the defensive line well, I believe, by adding a JUCO defensive tackle and Caleb Tremblay. Cornerback they addressed with Chase Williams. So they did some things that I really liked in the early signing period. Obviously, they locked up most of their commits that they had already had, all Justin Dedich and the 5-star linebacker, from Bishop Gorman and Raymond Scott, the other linebacker, which was another need that they needed to address in this class. So I thought they did a really good job on this early signing period of kind of just addressing the needs and getting close to filling the class up. And now they just really have a few more guys to sign, in February before their class is pretty much complete. So I liked what they did in December. And I think that there's a chance that they finish really strong in February. It just kind of depends on how many spots they have open from transfers and the NFL draft at this point.
Yeah, so some of those hard commits that you're talking about, you're extremely confident that they will be signed, that they're not out there to pick and choose and still looking at other schools.
I think the ones that USC wants for sure are hard commits. I think like Amon-Ra St. Brown just announced at the Army game. He's not signed. It'd be absolutely shocking. I would feel like almost impossible if he went somewhere else at this point. I think that a couple of the other guys that aren't signed, maybe USC, doesn't have room for them at the end of the day, or maybe there's another option that they end up getting, that home run option that they didn't expect. It's just hard to tell right now because right now they have, I believe, 3 scholarships to give out. Obviously, they want to take more than 3 guys. They just obviously got a commit from Amon-Ra St. Brown. JT Daniels is going to be in the 2018 class. They have, 2 more defensive linemen committed after them. So it's going to be a tight squeeze at the end of the day. But I think if they have room for everybody that's unsigned, they're going to come in. And then there's going to be a couple other guys that maybe they have a shot at as well. It's just that numbers game. We're waiting to see who declares and if anybody decides that it's time for them to transfer right now instead of waiting till the spring.
Talking up the Trojans with Chris Swanson from Trojansports.com. It's on the Rivals platform for USC athletics. We mentioned Ronald Jones declaring early for the NFL draft, Sam Darnold as well. in looking at the personnel on both sides of the ball and who's going to be lost and expected to be lost to the NFL draft, whether that be a senior or underclassman. Your thoughts about 2018? Obviously, the quarterback has to be found between Sears and Fink and so forth. And then just in regards to maybe some guys that were a bit off the radar that casual fans that caught USC a few times aren't aware of, but need to step in, or you're expecting to be impact players.
Yeah, I think it really all revolves around the quarterback. Like you mentioned, that's huge. Sam Darnold is a rare talent and a guy that you don't have, even every few years. So that's going to be the position that everybody's watching. And I think that's going to kind of determine everything. If it's Matt Fink, expect USC to kind of do more of a running attack than maybe we've seen in years past. You kind of see that in their offense, that they have this sort of option game that wasn't really utilized that much. He would utilize it more. Jack Sears, I think that is kind of like a mini Darnold. He's not that level yet, but you can expect sort of a similar offense to what they're running now. And he's a high level quarterback and, a guy that everybody expects to be really good. So you'd think in the future that they'd be pretty good with him. And then if JT Daniels ends up being the guy, it's pretty much a rebuilding year, freshman quarterback. They're planning for the future at that point. So I think that battle really determine where the program is going in a way. I think that fans should probably root for Jack Sears for the most immediate results. That's just my estimate right now. Outside of quarterback, we're still waiting to see where some of these guys going. Obviously, Cam Smith came back on defense, but they lost each other to Nwosu, who is a senior. But so we're going to have to see that linebacking core get a little bit stronger. I think you'll be looking for some of these names: Jordan Iosefa, John Houston, somebody like that probably got some playing time before to step in and do something special. I think if Amon Marshall leaves for the NFL, cornerback is going to be a position to watch for the defense next year as well, obviously, because he's been there forever, been starting forever. So some young guys there, and in this class, maybe it'll get determined with a Chase Williams or an Isaac Taylor Stewart or Elijah Griffin, because those guys could come in and start right away if need be. But who knows at this point? It'll just be a position to watch, really, to see what happens there, because they're thin at cornerback this year already. So I think the defense, it's going to be interesting to see how they kind of reload next year from some of these losses that they might take in the NFL draft. And then the offense, tailback and quarterback, everything else is kind of the same. Maybe the offensive line gets better, maybe they mature, but that's what you're watching. You're seeing if USC can find an answer, for the biggest names on offense. And it could be a serious rebuilding year, I think, without question. Next year, I think USC could be looking at a tough stretch and a tough record. And, I think it'll really determine if Clay Helton is up for the task, because if they win next year, if he finds a way to win 10 games, the expectation should be way different than this year. And if he finds a way to win 10 games, I think that will quiet a lot of people down.
So, Chris, that's certainly a point of note there, because I think while the roster may dictate and the schedule that it's going to be difficult to win a lot of games, the division sets up for USC, meaning that if you go to the other top programs in the country, Ohio State's got to deal with Penn State, Michigan State. Yeah. Alabama's got to deal with Auburn and LSU, and we could go through the rest of the lot. Maybe Georgia might be a different case because the SEC East is so weak right this second. And USC might be in the same boat. They might lose some games, but I don't know that anyone in that division, not that no one can challenge them, but considering the coaching turnover at Arizona State, and just the talent not being there, and of course UCLA, we'll see what they can do in a first year under Chip Kelly, that USC still, they could win 8 games and still make it to the Pac-12 championship game.
Yeah, that could happen. And you know what? Maybe if they do win 10 and they go through that division and it's weak again, because the whole conference was weak this year, and I think that played into the record. I could understand, that criticism. I could. I personally think that if you have a first-year quarterback and you're, and it's not somebody like Sam Darnold, and you figure out a way to win and you figure out a way to make that defense good, it's gonna, could be losing guys at every level, honestly. They already are at safety. They could be at corner. They already are at linebacker, and they could be along the defensive line, losing guys that are huge impact guys for them. To me, it would be impressive if they won 10 games regardless, because they would have to have a good defense, and I'm not sure that they will next year. And they would have to figure out how to move the ball. And honestly, if they didn't have Sam Darnold and Ronald Jones this year, I'm not sure they could have moved the ball with that offensive line. So the offensive line would have to improve. And that's probably, to me, the biggest point of emphasis in this program right now, because that's what I watched Notre Dame have, a top 10 level offensive line. Ohio State had that too. USC didn't. That's what jumped out to me about those two games. And I think that if that improves, this team has a future. If it doesn't, they don't. So I think next year we'll be telling you, if they win 10 games, I'm ready to say, hey, that's an impressive job to me, because I really don't expect them to get close to 10 wins at all. I think that they'll reset at quarterback, and it will cost them big problems, even with a weak division. So we'll see. But in my opinion, Clay Helton does that. If he gets to 10 wins next year, it's time to quiet down a little bit. But right now, I totally understand the criticism, because it's very warranted.
So I'm taking a bit of a different angle, that the record might not be that good. They've got Texas and Notre Dame, and Texas on the road. They could lose those two games. They go 7-2 in the conference. They're 8-4, and they go to the Pac-12 championship game. They could go, it's possible, go 6-3 in the conference, still win the division, go 7-5, and go to the Pac-12 championship game. Is not that much of a stretch, considering what a jumbled mess the rest of the division should be.
Yeah, I get that too, because Texas seems like they're improving. I know that they didn't have a great record this year, but they seem on the edge of being really good. And Notre Dame, it seems like they're kind of, every year they could be good. Sometimes they're really not, but they're always there too. USC's out of conference schedule makes it hard on them as well. That's something that I don't think a lot of people point out, because you see these other teams not scheduled that way. So we'll see. They will get tested regardless, even if the Pac-12 isn't tough. They were tested this year regardless, and it didn't turn out well for them. So
it's definitely something I mention from time to time, because you're right. Because I go through a scheduling analysis in July or August, and I rank all the schedules. And I typically have USC somewhere in the top 5 or 10. I think I had them with the number 1 schedule in America, meaning the most difficult schedule in the country a couple of years ago, because of what you just mentioned.
Yeah.
Most teams get some type of accolade or credit for going out and scheduling one really hard non-conference opponent. Well, USC has that in play all the time with Notre Dame, and then I think they feel as though they need to have another game, just because if they always schedule just Notre Dame and their conference schedule, that people will be like, this is a boring schedule. Yeah. We know what it's going to be every year. So they got to go out and run out and grab a Texas or somebody else. And so they have, and there are more teams in the last couple of years, Chris, doing this, scheduling 2 difficult games, but USC has been doing this for a long time, and they're very much still in the minority of scheduling 2 very difficult Power 5s. Yeah. And then last year they had Western Michigan, who was coming off a 13-0 Cotton Bowl team. So they had no gimmies during the entire season.
Yeah, and I think too that what people don't realize is they're in Los Angeles, and USC has to sell tickets to fans that need a reason to show up to games. They will just watch on TV. It's not Green Bay, Wisconsin, or Alabama or something like that. So you have them wanting to schedule Texas, like you mentioned, or other big name teams, and then even sometimes the team that's supposed to be a break doesn't come from the Mountain West Conference or something like that. Sometimes they'll come from the Power 5 conferences, because USC feels that they need to sell tickets. And, are you going to show up to USC versus San Jose State? Maybe the diehard will. But, so a lot of times you see like a Syracuse or a Boston College or some team that maybe, isn't a big name team, but they're very confident and able to beat you if you don't play well. So, yeah, USC schedules is really hard. They really try to make it as difficult as possible. And then I think the 9 conference games is a little bit of an underrated factor. The Pac-12 is usually a tough conference, even if they don't have that top end team. They usually don't have really bad bottom, kind of teams like the cellar dwellers, I guess we'll call it, kind of teams. They usually don't have that. So every team is a tough out. So yeah, next year USC's schedule could be really hard. It actually, you're right. It could end up being that way. And that wouldn't surprise me at all. And I kind of expect it to be more difficult than this year. I expect the conference to get better next year, because this year kind of seemed like, not really the norm for the Pac-12 at all.
All right. Love the discussion with Chris Swanson talking up USC football. You can catch him there on Trojan Sports. It's the Rivals Network for USC football. And of course, the recruiting coverage is unmatched across the board right there. Chris, we appreciate the discussion. Thanks for stopping by.
Yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it.